Hi, thanks for joining in. I'm really excited to bring to you some information from U.S. farmers and ranchers. This is the year of action on climate change, and really excited that you might be a financial leader and hoping that you can tune in today to learn about how you can support not only the year of action on climate change, but the decade of ag. Key to our success is the ability of our farmers to partner with the financial community to fulfill its potential to be a net negative contributor to a U.S. economy. I'm counting on you today to find creative ways that you can contribute and lean in as a leader in this effort. I want to say special thanks to Wells Fargo and United Soybean Board, who actually believe that this initiative needed to get off the ground. This is the start of a long decade, and this is what you will see today is the opening of a chapter on the conversation that we need to have about the need to stimulate catalytic capital into this sector. I couldn't be more excited for you to meet our co-authors on this panel today. From the Mixing Bowl, Rob Trice, from Croatan Institute, David LeZaks, and David Bennell from World Business Council. It has truly been a pleasure to roll up our sleeves with each other and bring to you this exciting insights today. I also want to say special thanks to our leaders in action who've been working over the last year to really roll up their sleeves and really ask some simple questions about how could we, really stimulate innovation and technology into this sector and find new forms of capital that could transform the sector in the next decade. This group really met over 15 times in the last year to really bring this report to life. So special thanks to everyone involved. So let's get into about the report. I want to stress that this is more than a report. We specifically chose this word transformative investment. We fundamentally believe in the next decade, we need to stimulate innovation and capital to help our sector grow. The report really looks at supporting the case for why agriculture should be included in the portfolio of net zero economy. Many of you are ESG investors out there, and you take a portfolio approach every single day. And one of the questions we want to ask ourselves is why not include agriculture as a key contributor in your portfolio when you think about climate mitigation and you think about revitalization of rural economies? This is a sector where green happens. This is a sector where innovation can happen. That's the next question we asked ourselves is what is the innovation sector's responsibility? Like, do we have the right pipeline? You're going to hear from Rob Trice today about, clearly we have a great startup community, but we can really encourage more startups, more innovation, and more technology for the future to help our farmers. And then finally, you will hear from David LeZaks and David Bennell. There is no doubt we can use creative financing to support our farmers in this quest to be a contributor to a net zero economy. You have to bet not only on the technology, but you have to bet on the people who can get this job done. And I really do think that this sector has a lot to offer. So you might not realize, and this maybe is taking us back to a little bit of sixth grade biology. I always say the brown stuff and the green stuff are the cool stuff. Nature-based solutions can suck down carbon. In fact, it's the only machine that's been able to suck down carbon for centuries. And we are now really, as an agriculture sector, tapping into that know-how. I know that many of you are currently investing in very cool technologies as we look at machines and other sectors. But the know-how of agriculture is truly phenomenal. We have been reducing our carbon footprint on a continuous path. We do have emissions, of course, like any sector. It's 9.9% of carbon. But this carbon is very different. There's black carbon, that's fossil fuel-based carbon. There's gray carbon, and that's carbon that if I recycle the water bottle is keeping carbon in the air. But green carbon literally is sucking carbon from the air through photosynthesis and cycling it through carbon, soils, and plants. And because our farmers are already working so hard on all these different technologies, they are on a pathway potentially to have their carbon footprint. But what we also know is that with considerable investment and partnership in frontier technologies and investment, we could accelerate the know-how of our farmers to maybe potentially be a net negative carbon. That would make agriculture the first sector to not only reduce its footprint, but create a handprint in our economy. as we think about this cycling of carbon for our future. It's pretty exciting stuff and often overlooked that this sector could be the portfolio solution to a net zero economy. So we would like to talk to you today that agriculture should long be really the backbone of any economy, and has been, particularly in COVID. I know you all took photos of and saw the food value chain for its first time at work, but we do a lot more than that. And we can cycle and store carbon and also mitigate and help our economy adapt to climate change. There is no other sector, you'll always hear me say that, there's no other sector that can put their values to work and go get it done. I want to think about a frame of where we are. Remember in about 2007, renewable energies needed a push. And we all knew that renewable energies was a sector that could help reduce our dependence on fossil fuel. And in order to do that, we took efforts to create renewable energy credit trades that stimulated a market. So if I couldn't afford a solar plant adaptation on my plant, I could make trade to make that market happen. The renewable energy sector was also very good about creating federal and state carve-outs. But what it did and did well is that back in 2007, with a fundamental belief that this sector needed to grow, there was financial tech investment that helped spur the innovation of that sector's growth. We need to do the same thing here in agriculture. We have a potential to be a net negative contributor to carbon, but we can't do it without partnership with the financial community. We fundamentally would like to see the investment and technology grow to support our sector. And what I'd like to do is pass it over to Rob Trice, who's going to talk to you about the current state of our innovation pipeline in technology and startup culture.
Thank you, Erin, and I'm pleased to be with you today and pleased to have worked on this report. And our organization, the Mixing Bowl, connects IT, food, and ag innovators for thought leadership and for action. And we were pleased to take on this report because we want to go see how we can fulfill that potential of agriculture to be a net zero climate solution. And so let me just lay out the report just a little bit, set the stage. We looked at 6 specific practices that are agricultural, obviously climate smart agriculture. They're soil centric. They're all proven by USDA. So we're not talking about anything that's kind of a frontier technology. They're all in field, and they all sequester carbon, reduce erosion, increase water infiltration, and they provide economic environmental resiliency. The 6 practices, just to hit them very quickly, are no-till and reduced tillage, cover cropping, crop rotation, composting, managed grazing, and integrated crop and livestock systems. We don't need to get into those specific practices, but just to let you know what we're talking about. And the other thing that we did in this report was really laid out in a very high level, what are the barriers to adoption that farmers and ranchers are facing today? We categorize those in 4 areas: economic factors, personal motivations, information and implementation, and also just external concerns like policy and so forth. So going to the next slide, what we did in this report was really looked at where we are and how do we actually start to scale this up. What we found when we were interviewing farmers and ranchers for this report was that when we talked about those farmers who had moved to climate smart practices, we kept hearing the term, we took a leap of faith. For whatever reason, they were taking a leap of faith. They trusted that the science was solid, but so what we want to do in this report is look at how we can use technology and finance innovation to close that gap. So that leap of faith becomes a shorter hop. And then ultimately that farmers and ranchers can embrace these practices in a confident stride where they feel confident about they got the knowledge and the functioning economic market reward there for them for making that change. And so that's really what we were doing, is trying to identify how we can make this practical and actionable for farmers and ranchers. So if you look at the next slide, what we did then is we stepped back and looked at 150 different technologies. We think this is the first time this has ever been covered, looking specifically at what are those climate smart soil technologies that exist today And I think if I just kind of step back at a high level, what we need to do is really look at how we can ease the burden of collecting data from the field, and then also connecting that data to other data sets or to downstream partners. We really need to get a virtuous cycle going so that we can start to test, learn, and adopt. Because one of the things that became quite clear is that while the tools are there, the data is not flowing yet for farmers to feel that they've got adequate locale and practice specific information to implement these practices in a confident manner. What I mean by that is if you, for instance, are doing rotational grazing on cows in, say, California, which is a Mediterranean climate, you may need to do that differently than a place like Georgia that's going to be much wetter. And so to be able to understand how you implement these, that's really the key. And Erin, maybe I'll leave it there.
Well, thanks, Rob. So, if you think about one thing I always love about you is you're always talking about action. You've been in this space for a long time. You've been part and parcel to the startup community that's been in ag tech for a while. What convinced you that the time is now to really help climate smart soil health practices go mainstream?
So I think that there's a lot of recognition that the time is now. There's an openness that perhaps wasn't there a couple of years ago on the producer side. More importantly, though, the technology is there. We definitely need to do things like increase the ease of use for farmers so we get greater adoption of these tools. But the number one thing that I think we really can focus on is making those connections. So breaking down, for instance, data silos, connecting willing ecosystems, producer ecosystems that are want to embrace these practices with these technology tools, and then also with the funders that are willing to reward them for making this transition. They need to know that that they're going to be rewarded for making good progress on these practices.
Yeah, no doubt. I mean, our farmers are hard at work, but it's been tough work, right? I need some partnership there. So, if you think about you always remind me that the startup cycle is so short, right? And happens at such a fast clip in 3 years, if not shorter. If you think about what needs to happen in the short term, the next 3 to 6 months, if you're listening to this and you're an investor, what do you think we need to do to make soil health promises that we've been talking about into a reality?
Again, it's that question of how can we go connect data? We need to go break down those data silos so that we get folks focused on, you see a lot of startups that have their own data and they're not sharing that. And so we need to get the data together so that farmers and ranchers can get a holistic view of their operation. They can share that information downstream with their value chain partners and ultimately with the people that are funding them to take on the practices and reward them for making these steps to transition.
Yeah, and when you speak of data too, to me, that's unleashing really the power of our science, right, in soils and decision making so that they can make climate smart adaptations right now. So I think that that's great. Okay, so we are going to hear now from David LeZaks from the Croatan Institute, who's going to walk you through the more transformative investment aspects of the report.
Thank you, Erin. And my name is David LeZaks. I'm a senior fellow at Croatan Institute. We're a nonprofit whose mission is to harness the power of investment for social good and ecological resilience. And as Rob mentioned, we really see multiple opportunities in this space. One, of course, on the technology side, and really the other piece is related to finance. And the work that we did related to this report and other work that we do within the Croatan Institute is to look at the finance and investment as tools for action, as relating back to what Erin said. And what we did in this analysis was to make sure that if you were a farmer or an agricultural value chain representative or a company, or you're an investor operating within an asset class, if you're an asset manager, an asset owner, you'd be able to really find each other, in this relatively complex space. So as we began to map out the agricultural value chains and the financial value chains, we began to see where some of these flows of capital were going. And as we began to total at least the available data up that we were able to gather as part of this exercise, seeing that nearly $1 trillion were flowing through the agri-financial system. And where we see that, those are the capital flows of today. And we understand that not only with an increased exposure and increased opportunity within environmental, social, and governance investing, within impact investing, with pools of catalytic capital, there are opportunities from the investor and asset owner side who are looking for new opportunities to deploy, new opportunities to generate impact or reduce risk with the capital that they manage, and wanted to not only highlight where those existing flows of capital could be going, where they could be strengthened, but also where there might be the ability to inject new capital into this space. And so within that, really wanted to highlight the different financial intermediaries, how important the public debt that is kind of primarily looking at the farm credit system, how commercial banks are kind of providing these financial products to farmers, but also in the public equity space, how larger companies who are publicly owned are accessing either traditional finance through that means, or we're looking at new forms of financial mechanisms that could come to market that way. Next slide. And as we look to this path of scaling up to a more climate smart agriculture, we see several different drivers and pathways here. The first one is that we know we need to kind of grow the size of the pie. So, out of the amount of money that's coming from government to support specifically practices on the farm, we know that there's an ecosystem service and specifically a carbon market that is growing, but the largest piece of that pie by far is the amount of private capital that is being invested into this space. And again, it's that pool of capital that we're here talking to you about, where we see so many opportunities in this space. And as we're framing this from the perspective of risk, return, impact, highlighting the opportunities that when you manage when soils are managed in a way that's going to improve soil health, that's going to increase carbon sequestration, you also reduce the agronomic risk. You reduce the likelihood that those crops might not get as high of a yield, that they'll be resilient to droughts and to floods. And we know that financiers and farmers really share this risk, this language of risk. And so from the perspective of risk management, investing in soil health, investing in climate smart agriculture really begins to deliver this risk mitigation to all parties involved. And we see that appropriately capitalizing this part of the sector is only going to lead toward decreasing risk, decreasing carbon, and increasing all of those other positive attributes that a more climate smart agriculture provides. Next slide. And so, to talk in very hand wavy, broad brush strokes around investing in agriculture, but realizing that those who are watching this probably either invest across an entire portfolio, across asset classes. They might specify their work in a specific asset class. And in the report, you'll be able to flip kind of, either to read the section as a whole, or look at each of the asset classes that we broke down, and to look at specific mechanisms that we think are really primed to help scale climate smart agriculture in the US. And within each of those, providing examples, providing pathways, providing next steps, providing existing entities both in the US and abroad about where some of these activities are happening, and where we see some of the near-term opportunities. And as Erin showed earlier, the list of companies that were specifically involved in the advisory roles in this in this report and our members or our contributors to USFRA is that we see many of these large corporates who are kind of pulling the covers back on their supply chains, looking all the way down to the level of the farmer and their practices, and realizing that in many cases, it's much easier for them to access larger pools of capital that can be used to assist these farmers in making some of these transitions into adopting some of the climate smart agriculture practices. And so that's where this large green arrow here is pointing at climate bonds, green bonds, blended capital facilities. Further down in private debt, we see sustainability linked loan facilities, and these others that are really focused. And setting up these mechanisms is going to take place in these interactions between larger corporates, supply chain companies, input providers, and new or existing sources of capital. And then the relationships and the capital kind of flows down to the farmers in ways that's going to make sense for the farmers in order to adopt these practices. And so many of the financial flows today, either going to farmers or to agricultural value chain companies, don't have that risk return impact relationship in mind as it relates to a changing climate, that the increased resiliency, the increased relationships with soil carbon. And we see that some of these alternative or new mechanisms are ways to really incorporate all of those, all of that differentiation into the financial transactions. Now back to Erin. Thank you.
So David, just thought there's so much there, and I hope people tune in. My favorite aspect of the report was that lovely little squiggly chart that you have there. I mean, starting out in this report, we always have talk in agriculture about government or ecosystem service markets, but we had no idea how much the private sector could play a role in this. As you think about the private sector getting involved, and really, I guess, when we think about inaction, like we don't have to wait. That was the big aspect of it. What types of actions do you think that the private sector could potentially take to really help us immediately move on a net zero pathway and help our farmers? I know we looked at some different investment tools, but what are you thinking?
So, first off, there's already a lot of investment in agriculture, but the outcomes and outputs of those investments might not be as aligned to a more climate smart agriculture that I think we'd like to see. And that's, one of the reasons why we put this report forward, is to have those capital sources begin to look at their investments as it relates to their whether it's scope 1, scope 2, scope 3 emissions that related to the SDGs, and how we really begin to align different frameworks, whether it be the Paris Accord, or going back to the SDGs, how we begin to put the investments that we have today or that we might be making tomorrow into these frames. And there's really so many to kind of begin to consider, and some are asset class by asset class, whether it's Sustainability Accounting Standards Board or a task force for climate related financial disclosures. But and as Rob kind of talked to previously, it's that we have to better understand kind of the data foundation that all of these investments are sitting on. And so it's what we know about the soil, what we know about these companies and the farms, how we begin to make decisions about how to best ways in order to farm for certain outcomes, best ways to invest for certain outcomes. And we see opportunities again within each of these asset classes in order to do that. It can happen with purchasing a farm and real assets. It can happen with private equity and VC when you're looking at specific technologies or entrepreneurial companies. It can happen within fixed income as we look at bonds and debt coming out of the farm credit system. So within each of these, it's hard. It's like your children. It's hard to pick a favorite one because there are so many that are really just ripe and ready to go. And we've seen so many examples of them in other sectors. And we just see now is the time to begin to port some of those innovations, some of those mechanisms over into agriculture.
Okay, well, I'm gonna make you pick some of your children here. So if we look at those asset classes on the next slide, if you had to pick sorry, next one. Yep. If you had to pick one that you could say, like, let's get going, let's start piloting, maybe we don't know enough about it, what would it be?
So, I mean, maybe it's the green arrow that clues you in here, but I think it really is. It's really, I think the in the public bond space, climate bonds, green bonds, and or a different flavor of that on the private debt side are environmental impact bonds. We've just seen so many examples of those in very closely aligned sectors or in the agricultural sector, but in a different geography, in China, in Brazil, in Europe. Here in the private debt, looking at the here listed is CAFCO International's $2.3 billion sustainability linked loan facility. Earlier this year, Google had a large sustainability offering that I believe was oversubscribed in a very short amount of time. So I think it's those larger players in this space that have the ability to bring in these larger pools of capitals. We also want to make sure that the burden of structuring, of accessing this kind of capital and the resources needed to make these transitions don't just fall on the shoulders of the farmers. We have to find out what is going to work for the farmers, what is going to work with them for the timeframes that they're operating on, for the timeframes in which the soil changes, which is not with the snap of fingers and is not overnight. And it's making sure that the financial mechanisms that are developed really do match with those agricultural or ecological timeframes as well.
Well, I do think your aspects of talking about these green bonds. I know as all of us were writing this in Q3 of last year, when we saw 10 billion in announcement of green bonds and ag wasn't even included in those announcements, we were like, hey, we can't get this report out fast enough. So
over here, look at us.
Right. And we hear a lot in the news, and just real quick, there's a lot of talk about carbon trading, carbon markets. How does that fit into this portfolio? Can you just give a quick overview about how we can think about this as a portfolio?
Sure. So I think it's definitely in the news almost every day these days, whether it's coming from government, whether it's coming from industry, those who are developing protocols or different ways to bring some of these either credits to market or just better understand some of these flows of carbon. And as demonstrated here in 2030, a report from colleagues of ours at the Ecosystem Service Market Consortium showed that there was about potential market for $14 billion for carbon, nitrogen, and phosphorus markets. And that's just it's a small piece of this puzzle. It's a really important piece, but we understand that it's just the credit markets are probably not going to be enough to drive these changes. Agriculture, by and large, is an industry based on margins. So even the smallest margin might make something fall into the profitability category. But even with that said, the transaction costs of those, they're coming down rapidly. The interest is going up, but still from an order of magnitude perspective, we absolutely think they're a piece of the broader conversation, but we have to make sure to have a more full conversation as part of that.
Absolutely, and think of it as a stackable benefit, just like renewables. So thank you, David. So we're going to turn to David Bennell and to really talk about the implications and opportunities for ESG investors.
Thanks, Erin. Thanks, David. Thanks, Rob. So great to be with all of you. And thank you, listeners, for tuning in. Yeah, if you'd go ahead and toggle to the next slide, please. You'll remember this one from earlier, and I wanted to re-show it in sort of the best Back to the Future, show me the money way. So you've just heard an amazing back and forth around how much is already flowing through the US ag system, nearly $1 trillion, who knew? And I think if that doesn't sort of capture your attention, I think this slide should, so let's take another quick look at it. So my organization, WBCSD, is 200 of the world's largest companies. It's CEO-led. We have about almost 10 trillion in annual revenue combined in our membership. And about 8 of our members were part of this working group. And I won't call them out, but let's look at sort of the breadth of the working group just for a moment to to ask the question, so who's interested in this? So I would just encourage you to take a look again. So some that you may not know, CEI is one of the largest community development finance institutions in the country. Really interesting place. I was lucky enough to be on their board for 9 years. Native American Agriculture Fund doing incredible work. BlackRock, State Street, they go without saying. You see some of the largest food and ag brands here. Farm Bureau, a number of the checkoffs, World Economic Forum, I could go on. Ceres, it's a nearly $30 trillion investor network. So when we say ESG and ESG investors, go ahead and toggle to the next slide, please. I want you to think about this almost actually bigger than ESG investors. It's all investors, because our members like Google, Apple, IBM, and Microsoft are all active in agriculture. So it's not just the iconic brands that we know and love, Kellogg's and others, it's tech companies. So why is this? Well, there's a lot of money to be made in this space. We've already joked about show me the money and $1 trillion potentially already flowing through the sector. But there's just an outrageous fortune to be made. And that's in large part why a number of our companies are active in this space. I'd also encourage you to think about ESG as a way to think about de-risking. Environmental, social, and governance it's very interesting, of course, and might have been a little weird for some people 3 to 5 years ago. There's nothing good about the pandemic, but what we were able to show right about the third quarter in 2020 is after about 6 months of the pandemic, WBCSD members on average, typically pretty good ESG performers, were holding their value in the marketplace 10 to 11% better than their peer group. Now, I don't know about you as investors, but if I were able to get 10 to 11% annually for my life in my 401k, I'd be very, very happy. So not losing 10 to 11%, it's not exactly the glass is half full way to look at the world, but this is how you spend your days, isn't it? Thinking about risk and trying to, in the old Wayne Gretzky metaphor, skate to where the puck is going to be, not to where it is right now. So the SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals, agreed by every United Nations country, full stop, in 2015. If there was any North Star for all of us in the world to be thinking about the agreed path forward for the world, agreed again by every head of state of every UN member nation, here it is. So if you don't know what the SDGs are, strongly encourage you to go take a look. We are very lucky with USFRA and some others to write a study last year on the US agricultural implications and opportunities in the Sustainable Development Goals. Those are available through USFRA's website as well as WBCSD's. And these are being used certainly have been used by EU investors and companies and governments. But if you've been paying any attention, we're filming this in the middle of February, to the new Biden administration, you will have noticed that Secretaries of Treasury, Defense, Transportation, and of course Agriculture, among others, have all mentioned these Sustainable Development Goals in their opening remarks as the new administration has come online. Next slide, please. So ESGs and investors, I just encourage you to think of yourself as an ESG investor. Because again, if you own Google, Microsoft, Apple, or IBM, 4 of our members, you're already active in the ag sector. Maybe you just didn't know it. And the one on this one that I think is so interesting is in the lower left-hand corner, these are all really full, maybe busy slides, is I would encourage you to think about ESG as a way to sort of think through the lens of de-risk. And again, just using the anecdotal data I gave you about our own membership in 2020, we are seeing more and more companies manage through an ESG lens. And of course, David LeZaks and Rob, Erin have all implied, also our investors like you are looking through ESG to evaluate those companies. So interesting sort of emergence of this. And so why does this matter now? Go ahead and toggle the next slide, please. Because you've seen this movie before. Erin, you gave the example of renewables. So 2007, 2008, 2009, through the whole Great Recession, renewables stayed alive and then really started to pick up speed. So this is, in a way, folks, your renewables moment. If you missed the movie in 2007 plus and you didn't get on board and you missed that moment, don't miss this moment. There's an incredible opportunity here. The other thing I'd add is as you look at your portfolio and you're trying to predict the future, just name any category that you're trying to see this through. Emerging markets, well, climate smart ag and ag, check. AI and the Internet of Things, agriculture and food sector, yep, check. Transportation and mobility, real opportunity in ag and food, check. The massive transition of wealth from boomers to millennials and Gen Z, yep, check. And of course, changing consumer demand and expectations of brands, check. So really it is such a neat opportunity. And I think the potential here in this report and you engaging in this with us and each other is again, if you missed the renewables moment, here we are. And I love that David LeZaks, you were raising your hand saying, pick me, or here we are. It really is an opportunity to engage and really sort of put the pedal to the metal. There's opportunity here. There's of course risk reduction potential here. And our members, I think are a decent sort of portfolio, wrong word, a cohort group that you can look to. Not everyone is perfect, not all are perfect, not any are perfect, but are managing a way that I'd suggest is slightly different and maybe probably smarter from a 21st century perspective. And the last thing, Erin, I know you want me to mention is an invitation to you, our listeners. I run for WBCSD something called the Food Systems Dialogue for Investors. We've run one about every quarter over the last year plus, and we average about $23 trillion of assets under management in this event. It's a 2-hour event. It's convened between companies and investors around the idea of global food systems transformation. And this subject you're listening to today couldn't be sort of more in the bullseye of that. So if you're interested in it, please reach out to Erin or myself to request an invitation. It will be in June, the date exactly to be TBD. But please stay in touch. We'd be delighted if you express interest in that and perhaps join us there. Erin, back to you.
Well, that's great. I love how you listed all the reasons really to get involved. And from a portfolio perspective, I'm going to add one I think we saw during COVID is people. You know, it's really an opportunity to do rural revitalization as well as we think about our farm economy and just the diversity as well of food access and the incredible role that agriculture plays. So I want to ask you one question. As you think about, you know, World Business Council has these deep relationships across the finance sector, the tech and food and ag, and you guys have long been challenging, you know, leaders to lean in on the sustainable development goals, and in particular, this idea of transformative investment. What will it take for leaders to really step up and include, you know, the order of the goals, right, as you matters. Goal number 2, what will it take to include agriculture clear in the goals of ESG investment?
Excellent question. You know, it's interesting. Let me start with equity. I want to go back to that one. So that's hugely important for us at WBCSD, right? So climate, nature, equity. I mean, there's a tripartite 3-legged stool that is essential here to move forward. You can't move forward one without the other. And we certainly can't move progress forward as important as it is on climate and or nature and leave people behind. So this is talk about a systems issue, and it's going to require systems answers. Now, the great thing about investors and investor networks is they are typically pretty much systems run. People watching this use systems every day to make decisions. And if somebody spent a lot of time on Bloomberg terminals, you know what I mean. In terms of sort of the things that might be interesting for people, Erin, to pay attention to get to the nut of your question, I think it's looking at, I would say looking at different types of companies and being very aware of what's coming online for them, and not to steal from David LeZaks exactly what he's already said, but to say it again. I just learned this morning, again in mid-February 2021, that one of our members is going to launch a new financial instrument, I'll call it, in May. And there'll be an absolute, pardon the pun, food fight to try and subscribe to that. Our member Google, as David already mentioned, David L mentioned, was oversubscribed. So I think, Erin, I don't mean to be crass, but there's a fortune to be made here, right? I'm interested in the way that companies get to profit. I like profit a lot. And I think, what will drive people is many things, but the opportunity to do good work while making good profit and creating good value, I think is almost irresistible. So let me stop there and put it back to you.
Well, great. No, I think what I hope that you'll take away, this is a very robust report, a year in the making. I think you can hear three co-authors here, Rob, David, and David, that there is just so much momentum with headwinds of ESG sales, ESG investment. And we really also believe that agriculture is a solution. There's just an encouraging broader context and conclusion to really look that, again, our farmers are stewarding 48% of the landmass across the country. Their true actions, I would encourage you to take a look at our film 30 Harvest, but this is the year of action, the decade of action on climate change. And when you think about a sector that can fulfill the promise of realizing the Sustainable Development Goals, realizing the potential of a net zero economy, being part of that transitional net zero economy across rural America and urban America, it is critical that agriculture is invested in really as an infrastructure sector to power not only a carbon economy, generative carbon economy, but a bioeconomy. So here you see our Decade of Ag that we are launching. This has been worked on over two years with 100 C-suite leaders. We are now at the point to endorse and launch that Decade of Ag, and it really requires any leader who is in action to lean in and say, yep, over the next 10 years, I will personally step up and dedicate my career to fulfill that vision and mission. It also calls upon organizations to really look at their current goals that they have, their ESG commitments, and say, you know what, I might not have all the answers, but I'm certainly willing to lean in and go figure it out and work with everyone. You can sign the vision statement and be part of all these different working groups. There's nothing to do other than put your best strengths to work towards this North Star over the next decade. So I encourage you to get involved. And here's how. So thank you. You can join in at usfarmersandranchers.org. You can take action by really talking to your other fellow colleagues who are in this space about, are we really investing in farmers and ranchers? Are we thinking about agriculture as part of our portfolios? And figure out what you could do to put your organizational strengths to work, your ESG commitments, and really would just encourage you to get involved. Thanks.